Good morning.
All right, where are we in terms of logistics and stuff? Everybody is registered for Achieve, doing homeworks. Anybody having issues with that? No? Okay. Yes?
I opened the end of chapter 2 problems last night. I didn't attempt them, I just wanted to see, and it gave me a 0. Can I still go back and do those?
Oh,
Yeah, you can still
yeah,
do
right
it.
now.
Okay, I just
You can
wanted
still
to
do
make
it. It just takes a minute to update.
Does what?
It just takes a minute to update because I automatically
Okay.
grades.
Okay. Good to know.
I had that same problem.
Who's got supposed to be bringing news today? Somebody should know on schedule for today. Maybe no one watched. Lap this. Open this. This. And this. And okay, that's bad. Today's date is the 26th, correct?
Correct.
Is Nick Roach here?
it's in the fifth watching thing.
Nick? No Nicks? Okay. All right, Nick. I've been recording this, and if you're online, you should have posted something before class, but you can still post something later today or tomorrow, and I'll get to it. All right. So I'm recording this, and you just got called out. On the 28th, it's GU. GU in this, yeah. So you'll have something for us on Friday?
Yeah.
Great, thanks. Am I saying it right? GU?
Maybe it's pronounced like Zhi.
Drew you?
Okay.
Yeah, when I try to do the tonal, my daughter always laughs at me. Because she lives in Shanghai for a year and a half, and she learned how to do all those tonal things. And Dad just stop trying. What are you talking about?
Yeah. I knew you weren't from around here.
What are you talking about?
Say coffee.
I knew you weren't from around here. We're building the classical model. Haynes model. Now, what's interesting is that they didn't actually express it in these terms. The expression of the Keynesian model, or the pre-Keynesian model, what had to be done for those who only learned the Keynesian model. And so we express everything in the rhetoric or the language of Keynes these days, for good or for ill. And so we're going to do that today. Now, we started off with the basic production function. And we said, okay, well, output is going to be some function of capital and labor. Of course, there were a lot of other factors also involved, but we simplified it to that. And then we say, well, let's give that an expression. Well, we can say that that is some function of capital and labor related to one another by this alpha. And the idea was that that alpha is capturing the idea that there are decreasing marginal returns to both capital and labor. So whichever we're talking about, whether I'm talking about capital or labor, in terms of output, the more capital I have, right, the output per unit of capital is decreasing at the margin. Same for labor. Why is that true for labor? Ask your neighbor, why are there decreasing marginal returns or decreasing marginal output to additional units of labor? Talk to your neighbor about that for a little bit.
Yeah, so the more people you get to the less productive they are, you get.
Yeah, I guess.
Okay, so in the back there, what do you guys come up with?
Yeah.
Okay, we gotta get on this quickly here. I'll give you another minute or two.
What would you say?
Make sure you're talking to somebody.
Yeah.
So we're talking. I'm gonna talk.
So these kinds of questions are sort of foundational and intuitive kinds of questions, right? They're really trying to understand this project of humanity that we're talking about. What did you all come up with?
We were basically saying that eventually, like, you'll have more work to do, so then people end up doing like less amount of work than they would if they were by themselves.
Can you give me an example?
Like, if you have 5 people working on a project, then each of those 5 isn't gonna work as hard because they know that other people are also working, whereas if it was just one person, they might work harder.
Okay, so there's slacking off that occurs as there's more and more people involved. So that's a collective action problem, and that's an interesting insight. Anyone else have another way of thinking about this? Yeah.
As more and more employees get hired, they're going to get paid probably a similar wage to the person who was hired before them. So the company has to pay so much money to hire a new employee. That new employee, kind of paired with what he was saying, might not have to do as much work because now he's a part of a larger team and they're expanding for the same amount of work roughly, but they're also paying maybe marginally more money.
Okay, well, you assumed that Y was being held constant though, in your analysis there, that the total amount of work wasn't fluctuating. But the total amount of work that's being done is fluctuating. You're adding another worker and more work is getting done. Yes,
If it's like Amazon and it's like a job is like to like put stickers in all the boxes and everything, if you keep adding people to that line, like there's only gonna be so many boxes that keep coming through. So eventually it's like there's so many people putting on stickers and then like there won't be enough boxes for the people to like put stickers on.
okay, well, that's a total kind of analysis, though, not a marginal analysis. Right, at some point you reach the point where that could be true with a straight line as well. There's a limited amount of work that eventually needs to be done. This is great, right? I'm glad that I did this because these are foundational kinds of questions, but we don't always get challenged to think them through. So I'm happy about this, yes.
Is it just because they get in each other's way when they're trying to work? Like,
That's definitely part of it. That's definitely part of it. Did I have another hand over here?
That's what I was gonna say.
Okay, yeah,
I just thought it could be the employees who are now being hired could be aware that because they're being hired, the company is making more money and making more productions, they're expecting more. So it costs a little bit more to get more employees.
in that case, you're introducing like some assumptions about the competitiveness of the labor market, which I think that complicates things more than it helps. But it's an interesting way of thinking about it. I like the getting in each other's way example. Also, if you're gonna hire workers, right, which worker are you going to hire first? The one who's most productive, right? So there's differences in the quality of workers. The first person you're gonna hire is gonna be the one who's the most productive. Most productive in terms of what? Well, in terms of wage that you have to pay them, right? Productivity divided by wage. That's your benefit as an employer. And as you hire additional people, right? If you hired the best worker first, then the next worker obviously can't be as good as the last worker was. Now, that might not necessarily be true. The second person might not be as skilled as the first person, but there might be synergies and specialization that can occur by having two people working together, right? That the total output at the margin actually increases. So it actually could be upward sloping at the bottom here. or downward sloping, yeah. It's a hard puzzle. We do assume though that in the limit, right, in the real world where we get to, that the marginal employee is less productive than the employee that was hired before them. Have I confused you or have I helped you? A little bit of both. Good. Read the textbook. The same is true for capital. The same is true for capital. The additional units of capital, eventually the space gets crowded. Right? You can have one oven at the pizza joint and it helps you make a lot of pizzas, you have another oven, you can make more pizzas, but at some point, right, given, holding everything else constant, holding land constant and entrepreneurial talent constant, right? At some point, you can't have the entire pizza joint just be ovens. You gotta have room for some people to make the ovens, to make the pizzas too. So there's those kinds of decreasing marginal returns to both capital and labor. Okay, good. Now, how would I calculate the marginal returns to capital or labor? We might take this equation and complicate it a little bit more and say that, capital and labor don't capture everything. Increasing capital and increasing labor, that isn't necessarily the only ways that we get more stuff in the real world. Another way that we get more real stuff in the real world is improvements to technology. So we might have an equation an expression that is y equals A kappa alpha L1 minus alpha. It's not a very good alpha, but there you go. Okay. And the idea here is that A represents technology. So improvements in technology. And that is sort of exogenous to this system. So any improvement in technology would be represented by a upward shift of the production function. If we're just thinking about capital or labor. You follow? Okay. Now, we say that the income share that gets paid to capital, how much of the total output, if it's divided up between owners of capital and labor, how much gets paid to capital? And the answer is alpha. That's the income share to capital. Now we could show that by taking the first derivative, what share of output is paid to capital. And we take the first derivative of this equation with respect to capital, and we get basically alpha. Is that right? Well, no, we would get alpha A times, how do I want to think about doing this? I'm going to hold off on that. But we're going to say that alpha is the income share to capital, and that 1 minus alpha is the share to labor. We'll come back to this. Now, in thinking about how stuff gets made in the real world, we recognize that there are the factors of production. And those factors are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurial talent. We say that the factors of production are owned not by firms, but by individuals, by households. So households own the factors of production. And then they take those factors of production and sell them to firms. Well, you say the firm owns the machinery. Not a smart firm. A smart firm will finance the machinery. Or it'll rent the machinery. The smart firm tries to run as little overhead risk as possible. So and even if that is true, then the households are the owners of the firms. They own the property of the firm, the shares involved. Well, households sell their factors of production to firms. They sell their labor to the firm. They sell their land to the firm. And then the firm, right, makes products. It produces output. And those outputs then are purchased by households. Is that all that's happening? Well, this is the flow of the resources. Resources flow from households to firms, and then the products flow from the firms to the households. Of course, there's also the government, right? And the government also buys stuff. So firms also sell stuff to the government, and the government provides some services to households, but the government gets its money from households and it uses that money to buy products from firms. And households use money to buy stuff from firms, and firms use money to pay households. So this is sometimes called the circular flow, and there's all different kinds of versions of this. There's also not just ownership of the factors of production, but there's also entrepreneurship, which involves the storing away of what we call sequestered capital. Resources that are being saved up for use in production in some other capacity that hasn't been brought to market yet. So there are no products being made yet. Sequestered capital is the preparation to bring goods to market. We'll talk more about that later. This is research ongoing with Dr. McClure that I'm participating in now. So if we have output, we're going to go back to the simplified production function. It is some function of capital and labor. Let's assume that the total amount of output is fixed. So when I put a bar over a variable, then we're holding that variable fixed. Now output would only be fixed if also capital and labor are fixed. Or maybe there's some different mix of capital and labor, but presumably we would have already chosen the optimum mix of capital and labor in order to get that level of output. And so then at that point, we're not going to vary the amount of capital and labor either. In this case, then we want to think about, well, what is the wage that gets paid to labor? We use W to talk about the wage that gets paid to labor. This is the return to labor. And we say rent or interest is the return to capital, or the wage that gets paid to the owner of capital. And let's add a couple other variables to this model. We're going to say that P is the price of 1 unit of output. So whatever goods we're producing here, Y is the total amount of stuff that got produced. P is the price per unit. So how many units did we produce? Y divided by P. That would give you quantity, right? Because Y equals P times Q, price times quantity, right, then the quantity is equal to total output divided by the price. Similarly, the price is equal to total output divided by the quantity that was produced. Pretty straightforward stuff so far. We might ask, well, what is the real wage? In other words, what do I mean by real wage? When we correct our measures of GDP to calculate the real terms, what we want to know is how much stuff can I buy? Not what the price of the stuff is, but how much of the stuff that there is can I buy? And so then the real wage is equal to W divided by P. It's the payment to labor divided by the price of stuff. And that's how much of the stuff gets paid to the workers. Similarly, the real rental value is going to be R divided by P. This is pretty straightforward stuff, and mostly what we're doing here is practicing using these variables to talk about things. I haven't thrown anything really truly astounding at you yet. It might even be boring. I wouldn't be surprised if it were. It's not really. All right, then, if each factor is fixed, we have a fixed quantity of capital, then the supply of capital can be described as being perfectly vertical. Or we say perfectly inelastic, right? What's the price of capital? This is talking about the quantity of capital. This is the quantity that we have when capital is fixed. What's the price of capital? It's R over P. So if quantity of capital is fixed in terms of supply, then it's not sensitive to price. It's not sensitive to price in the short run. Okay. So how are we going to think about this? We have to remember that the firm has an objective. It wants to maximize profit. So it chooses a combination of capital and labor in order to maximize profit. What's profit? Well, profit is equal to total revenue minus total cost. That should sound familiar to you. Okay. Well, what variables can I replace for revenue and cost? Well, profit is equal to total revenue. Total revenue is the price of all goods that are sold times the output. Everything that was produced. Price times quantity. Okay, well, what are my costs? Well, my costs are the rental rate times the number of capital units that I own, minus the wage rate times the number of workers that I'm hiring. So here I have revenues, here I have costs. Okay. Well, let's put this, so far I have this all in nominal terms. Let's put this all in real terms. In order to make things in real terms, I divide everything by price. So then I get pi over P equals F of K times L minus R over P times K minus W over P times L. And I can take that one step further and replace the first expression with, instead of the function, I can replace it with the function that we've come up with for that. So we can say that real profits are equal to alpha K, or A times K alpha times L1 minus alpha minus R over P times K minus W over P times L. Now I've got this all set in terms of the real market. And in order to maximize profits, we take the first derivative. Woohoo, calculus. If I want to maximize profit with respect to capital and labor, then I'll take my first order conditions, and I'll say that the marginal product of capital, if I take the first derivative with respect to capital, and I get the marginal product of capital minus R over P. Similarly, if I take the first derivative with respect to labor, I get the marginal product of labor minus W over P. And to solve for the maximum, I set this equal to 0. Or I set this equal to 0. And so the productivity, the maximized productivity is when the marginal productivity of capital is equal to the rental price of capital. Similarly, the maximized quantity of capital is when the marginal product of capital is equal to the wage rate of labor. Now, we remember from this graph that the marginal productivity of capital is decreasing with output, and that the marginal productivity of labor is decreasing with output. So what that means is that on this graph, the demand for capital is based upon the marginal productivity of capital, which is decreasing in terms of this. So we get a demand for capital that looks like this. And as a result, we discover the optimal price of capital. And you do all the same thing for labor. And that's how the wage rate is set. So you remember, right, this is the marginal product of capital. So if you remember from intro micro or from a labor econ class, that the wage in the market for workers is based upon the marginal productivity of labor. The last worker that you hire is the worker whose output, whose productivity is just barely worth hiring them in terms of their output. Are you with me? If they were not worth what you were paying them, you would not pay them. So in a recession, if a firm finds itself in a situation where it has to lay some people off, who gets fired first? Least productive. Typically the least productive person. Now, is that always the case? Some people have seniority, right? So they are typically not let go of first. Okay. Although the university just sent out emails near the end of last semester to all the professors. And if you're eligible, the university is offering to pay you 125% of your salary for next year if you retire at the end of this year. So quit at the end of this year, we'll pay you for one more year, 125% of your existing salary, but please go away. Now, who's most likely to be eligible for retirement, for early retirement like that? Well, I have a list of conditions, but it's typically people who have some sort of seniority, people who've been here a while. Well, if people have been here for a while, what might their salary be like? More than mine. They're expensive, right? These geezers that are still hanging around, they need a retirement. I love my colleagues. I learn a lot from them. They're an input into my production function. They help me to become more productive. But the longer somebody's been here, the more likely it is that they're very expensive. So they're buying out people who've been here for a while. Now does that mean that, oh, we're gonna let them go because they're not productive? Well, that's also kind of true, right? A professor who's achieved tenure, right, is safe. They don't have to continue to publish as much as somebody like me, who's brand new, relatively speaking, and there's a lot of pressure for me to publish, right? So in terms of productivity, they already have reached that maybe even point of negative marginal productivity. Okay, so there's that. They're expensive. They're not very productive. Let's get them out of here. What other things might be happening there? So the cost, the marginal productivity, the wage, might be relatively high for that person as compared to me. I get a 4-4 teaching load and don't get paid what they get paid, which means that I'm bringing in a ton of revenue. Which means that I am an underpriced asset. I am an underpriced asset. Shout it from the rooftops, tell the whole world. Okay. So then we have to look at the quality adjusted price of workers, not just their salary, but the quality adjusted salary based upon their productivity to decide who to let go. But oftentimes the last person that you would have hired, right, would have been the least productive person, so they're first to go. So it looks like seniority makes you safe, but only if you're actually being productive. Now, there's also the fact that if you're a part of a firm for a long time, you're part of the culture, right? You have firm-specific knowledge that is valuable to the firm, that makes you more productive at the firm than you would be elsewhere. That might actually give you an incentive to stay, even if they cut your wages, even though it'll make you mad, and because it means you're not as valuable to anybody else. There's a lot of stuff going on there. Okay. So the firm will hire the worker if the cost, the wage rate, is greater than the benefit, and at the margin, right, this person is worth it, and this person is not. So we're always looking for the marginal case. So we can take this a step further and say that if output is constant, same sort of framework, then the wage that will be paid to workers is the same as the marginal product of labor. And so output will be equal to the marginal product of labor times the number of workers that are hired, plus the marginal product of capital times the number of units of capital that are hired. And in this story, all income is going to be paid to capital and labor. Empirically, right, using the old y equals c plus I plus g plus nx formula, we saw that consumers spend about 68% of total GDP, and investors spend about 17% of GDP. And if we were to take government spends maybe 17% of GDP, and then exports makes up, and writers at 7, I'm not sure, -3% of GDP. We take just these two, that's a total of 85, and 68 divided by 85. What does that give you? Let me get that number real quick. Divided by 85, about 0.8. Right, and 17 divided by 85. It should be obvious. Just want to double check though. Is about 0.2. That indicates that the payment that goes to consumers or laborers is about 80%, and the payment that goes to investors, the owners of capital, is about 20%. If we hold these other things constant. Generally, the numbers that I hear for these values are closer to 0.7 and 0.3, but they're in that neighborhood. And again, the point that I'm trying to emphasize to you all is that payroll is your most expensive variable in your budget. People are expensive. Kids in particular, really expensive. The income to capital is equal to the marginal productivity of capital, which is equal to alpha times y. So the marginal productivity of capital times the amount of capital, which is alpha times y. So alpha is the percentage of output that gets paid to capital, once we think about all of the people who own capital. And similarly, the marginal productivity of labor times the number of workers gets paid 1 minus alpha of all output. In the same way. Now you gotta, how much does any one individual worker get paid? Well, that would be, one individual worker would get paid 1 minus alpha over y divided by the total number of workers, if we assume that all of the workers get paid the same amount. Question?
What does that say right after capital?
Capital share, sorry, thank you, capital share of output or of total income. Thank you. Not a problem. Running out of paper. That's not paper. One more sheet, so that'll determine how far we get with class today. We're close to. We're not that close to. Very small. That's the production side of the market. Now we want to think about the consumption side of the market, the goods side. So in terms of goods, the question is, who will buy? Who will buy this glorious morning? Sky so high, I never did see. How many of you seen Oliver? The old musical. Like, dude, we don't listen to musicals unless it's La La Land or Hamilton. All right, we're going to start building our consumption side of the market by considering first the closed market. So no trade. So we're going to neglect net exports. We're not going to consider that in our model. What's left? Well then, y is just c plus I plus g. There's no nx. And that is kind of our aggregate demand. How much stuff do we want to buy in nominal terms? So C is for consumer goods. All right, it's the demand, the consumer demand for goods. I is the demand for investment goods, like capital. And G is the demand for goods by the government. Now, consumption, we want to think about, okay, you earned some money. Right? You earned some money, but you're going to consume not all of your money. Why? Well, because you have to pay taxes. So consumers receive some income, but they have to pay taxes based upon that income. What happens if income goes up? If income goes up, consumption goes up. Right? Okay. What if taxes go up? Well, it's related by a negative sign, so if taxes go up, consumption goes down. It seems intuitive, but it needs to be spoken. Now, John Maynard Keynes had to think about what consumption was like. And now you might say that, okay, given my income minus my taxes, what will my consumption look like? How much will I consume? And you might think, well, if I don't make any money, then I won't consume anything. But the more money that I make, the more I'm going to consume. I'm going to consume everything that I make after paying the taxes. And you get sort of like a 45-degree angle going on here, right? Start at the origin and go on up. But is that true? Do we consume everything that we earn? No, what do we do with some of what we earn? Save it for a rainy day, or for retirement, or to invest, so that we get rich, we let our money work for us, right? So then we don't actually have this straight line like this. Instead, we have something more like this. Now this graph is a little bit controversial in a couple of different ways. And one thing that I find most controversial about it is that it doesn't start at the origin. What does that mean? Yes.
Isn't there a certain level of consumption that you have to spend? Is that kind of what it's
Yeah,
saying?
it's a certain amount of consumption, a certain level of consumption that you have to spend, or what?
Yeah.
Or you get dead,
Yeah.
right? You get dead. Okay. So Keynes begins with the presumption that you can't get dead. That's not very economical. You can all get dead. I didn't really mean that. But it's possible that you can get dead, right? But he presumes that everybody's going to engage in a certain level of consumption such that they don't get dead. Okay, they're not getting dead, fine. But this is your income, so what must be the difference? You gotta be borrowing. Or somebody's gotta be gifting you something, right? You gotta be borrowing. Okay, fine. Now, what if your income is greater than your consumption? You're saving. Sure. So here you're borrowing, here you're saving. Pretty straightforward. Okay. So what Keynes thought was there is a marginal propensity to consume. That is less than 1 for 1. So your marginal propensity to consume is less than 1. Somewhere between 0 and 1. Are you going to save all of your income? No, you got to live. Okay. Are you going to save none of your income? No. Now, what's interesting about this is he gives it a particular slope. Such that no matter what your income level is, you're going to save the same ratio of it. Is that true? Is your marginal propensity to consume constant across different income levels? Right now, your income levels are relatively low, which means that you are borrowing, right? You're borrowing a lot, okay? When you earn more, you'll save more, but are you going to save the same relative portion of your income no matter how much you earn? No, probably not. However, this is sort of the model that we work with for now. This is sort of the way we work it for now. How much is going to be consumed? It depends upon the marginal propensity to consume. Keynes was worried about this savings, because that savings indicates a general glut. I mentioned the general glut last time with respect to Malthus versus Say, right? Jean-Baptiste Say said supply creates its own demand. If you make it, someone will buy it. But during the Great Depression, one of the problems was that people started making a whole bunch of stuff and other people were poor, so nobody would buy it. And there were these huge inventories of stuff that nobody was wanting to buy, and all that stuff was wearing out over time. Right, so the inventories were an indication that there was a problem. Why aren't people buying? Keynes thought the problem was a deficiency in aggregate demand, that people were not wanting to buy as much. So how can we fix the problem of a deficiency in aggregate demand? We got to get people to want to buy again. Okay, how do you get people to want to buy? You give them more money. Then their aggregate demand increases. So his solutions to the problem of the recession, right, were all involving increases in aggregate demand, and it's all framed, all pushed through this framework, right, of a marginal propensity to consume that is less than 1. What else is missing from this picture? Well, there's no investments, or there's no interest rate going on here yet. All right, we will complicate this some more on Friday. Any other questions for me now? Okay, thank you very much.